Irvin Studin Global Brief Magazine and the Institute for 21st Century Questions. Let's talk about the third major catastrophe of the pandemic period. It will surprise you. Third bucket kids. The COVID-19 pandemic led to two major catastrophes, at least, of which everyone is generally aware. First, the public health catastrophe, obvious. Second, the economic catastrophe, increasingly obvious. But there's a third major catastrophe at our feet that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and of which people are generally unaware, or of which they're only gaining an appreciation now, but of which they don't have a felt appreciation. It is the catastrophe of third bucket kids. Indeed, it is the education catastrophe in its most pathological, in its most vicious form. That is the third great co-equal catastrophe of the pandemic, and in my view, humbly, the catastrophe that will have the most enduring human, economic, and strategic consequences for many countries around the world and for the entire planet for decades to come. What is the catastrophe of third bucket kids? Well, let's start with what is a third bucket kid. You will appreciate that as soon as the pandemic hit, kids who were in classical school, which is the first bucket, were immediately thrust into one of two buckets. We imagine that most people shifted, at least in advanced countries, to a second bucket that we call virtual or online school. This is the second bucket. So I repeat, classical or physical school, the first bucket, online school, the second bucket. And indeed, when decision makers announce that we're shifting learning online, we all imagine that everyone is seamlessly shifting to the second bucket. But there's a third bucket that arose in catastrophic form, and indeed it's growing by the day. It's called no school at all. Bucket 3. And the kids in this bucket are the third bucket kids. They are in hundreds of millions around the world. In even the most advanced countries, Canada, my own country, over 200,000. In the United States, tens of millions. In India, in Pakistan, in Argentina, in Colombia, in France, in Philippines, around the world, there are hundreds of millions of kids who are suddenly in the third bucket, whereas but a year ago, they were firmly ensconced in the first bucket. These are not necessarily poor kids or kids who had a tenuous connection to schooling. They're certainly not bad kids. They are kids who were in the parks, on the cricket pitches, on the basketball courts, on the football pitches, on the ice hockey rinks, but a year ago they were playing at our feet. And they arrived in the third bucket through systems collapse purely. I will explain in a moment how that came to be. But let me say that the catastrophe of third bucket kids requires the most urgent solution, even more urgent than COVID itself, which is not going away anytime soon, because kids in the third bucket, if they consolidate in that position, have nowhere to go in life. They have no education. In the hundreds of millions, and thrust into a COVID world, imagine that this is a timeline, and the child here is with limited education. This period here is a period of great pain and misery and often early death in huge numbers for these third bucket kids through systems collapse. So the purpose of leadership today around the world must be, right alongside the public health and economic catastrophe, to find these kids in huge numbers and to reintegrate them into schooling, into the first and second buckets within the coming months. Otherwise, we lose them in huge numbers for no reason, again, other than systems collapse, to the death and to a miserable condition around the world, which is destabilized greatly all of a sudden by the rise of a huge underclass of people who are patently not educated. And about whose non-education we've only learned belatedly. So how does one come to arrive at the second bucket? Well, as soon as we go from the first to the second bucket, A good proportion of the student population, just as with the general population of countries, has no access to internet. Leave aside access to a laptop, no access to internet. In Canada, my own country, 6%. In other countries, 50%. In parts of South Asia, 70%, 80%, 90%. And diminishing over time as material resources make access to online increasingly prohibitive. That provides your baseline quantum for people who are ousted from the first bucket immediately to the third bucket. But let's go to the second bucket. If you're in the second bucket, but you're all of a sudden in an abusive home, if you're in a home in which resources are diminishing over time and you must go work, if you are in a home in which the language of instruction online, if you're a new immigrant in Canada, the United States, or Europe, or Argentina, and you arrive in the second bucket and you have no access to the language of instructions, nor do your parent, you will soon be ousted to this bucket here. Indigenous homes, poor homes, rural homes. Let me add, colleagues, the idea that teenagers, adolescents studying in high school in the second bucket for 2, 3, 4, 5 months at a time. This is the most dangerous form because these teenagers, if one could only go back to one's adolescence and understand that they might have had a different connection to school than pure academics. They might have gone for a boyfriend, a girlfriend, sports, arts, collegiality, mentorship, friendship, the community, the walls. The walls here are thick. This is classical bucket 1. The walls here are non-existent. So a teenager who is increasingly disengaged from school psychologically because of the loss of all of the content and meaning and spirit of school in the second bucket can be ousted very quickly with no obstacles. And may I add, anonymously. The ouster consists only in turning off the button and leaving school. And in many cases, no one is aware, no one is looking. 2 years go by, and that teenager consolidates the position of ouster, and they are out into the world. In many parts of India and South Asia, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, children left urban schools, returned to the village, and for 2 school years were out of school altogether. They would go on to labor, early marriage, household activities, no prospect of return as soon as the school was closed. Early pregnancy, sexual abuse, all of these things are things that consolidate the condition of ouster very quickly and in catastrophic numbers. What's to be done? Well, at the Institute for 21st Century Questions, which I head, which publishes Global Brief magazine, we began to notice this problem at our feet, even in the most advanced countries of the world, starting with my own Canada. Children who were just in a rich kid paradox, out of school for reasons only known to their families. A family would take a decision in the abstract, I'll keep my kid out of school until it's safe to return. And that child would stay out of school for 2 years with no place to return, and all sorts of perverse incentives take place at that time. Realizing the numbers, we canvassed around the world, determined they were huge, saw the research, we launched a commission. That commission is now working at full speed. It's called the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids Post-Pandemic. That commission has attracted members, top leaders in education, public policy, politics, culture, sport, art, and business from countries around the world, 50 in total thus far and growing, who are seized of the catastrophe, first seized of its scale and now seized of the need to, in the most dutiful way, find these kids at the human level and reintegrate them with the greatest speed into schooling. That is the job of the Commission. We will attract and seduce leadership to be with us, because leadership and ministries and machineries of government will in the end effectuate this, but these children must be reintegrated with great choreography and great speed in the coming months. In many cases by the coming fall, and in the southern calendar within the next half year. Let me just close by saying that not all countries in the world had the catastrophe of third bucket kids. Canada had it, the United States had it, India, Pakistan, even Israel. But there are countries in in East Asia, for instance, that had perfect internet access and that had a systems understanding and that had mobilization capabilities and did not allow this ouster to happen. In parts of Central Europe and Western Europe, Austria, Germany, the norm of compulsory schooling held. It was not collapsed by the pandemic, whereas it was collapsed in many other advanced countries. So they look at these countries with the problem of third bucket kids as if they're from Mars, and perhaps properly so. What on earth do you mean you have masses of kids not in school at all, with no prospect of return? Another category is countries of the former Soviet space who were quite sang-froid about the pandemic. They never closed the schools because they realized, well, they'd been through many things before. The schools stay open except in the event of war. These are categories of countries, many of them paradoxical, that look at the third bucket kid countries with not total understanding. And perhaps rightly so, because this is a catastrophe that is totally paradoxical in the 21st century, that we should have huge masses of kids all over twists in the end who have had the floor pulled out from under them and with no prospect of success in the post-COVID world unless we find and reintegrate them. That's our task.